the live stream there. My name is Arik Burakovsky, and I manage the Russia and Eurasia program here at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I've been at Fletcher since 2014, and it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces in the audience. I look forward to congratulating and catching up with many of you today and tomorrow. And I'm also excited to make some new acquaintances this weekend among the notorious Fletcher Mafia. I'm honored to moderate this panel discussion on the implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine for international law and security, with three of our distinguished and revered professors, two of whom recently got tenure. One of whom will receive the 2022 James L. Paddock Teaching Award.
Yeah!
So we're nearly 3 months into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has tragically led to thousands of soldiers and civilians killed and wounded, more than 10,000 war crimes allegations, millions of displaced people, billions of dollars in infrastructure damage, and more than $1 trillion wiped off the global economy. The war in Ukraine started back in 2014 with Russia's annexation of Crimea and the hostilities in Donetsk and Luhansk. The escalation of the war that began on February 24th, 2022, resulted from a complex and multidimensional set of trends. They include the fraught history of Russia-Ukraine relations, the security dilemma between Russia and NATO, the pro-Western drift of Ukraine, the rise of a personalistic autocracy in Russia, the failure of diplomacy between Russia and the West, and Vladimir Putin's miscalculations. When Putin launched what he calls a special military operation in Ukraine, he expected to take Kyiv within just a few days. But the military campaign has gone badly for Russia. Putin misread Ukrainians' desire and ability to resist Russia's military advances and occupation. He assumed Western sanctions and military assistance would be negligible, and he was unable to predict the tactical blunders that were made by the Russian military, including inadequate planning, poor logistics, and low morale. In what has become a war of attrition, Russia has made marginal territorial gains in southern and eastern Ukraine, imposed a blockade on the Black Sea, and captured the cities of Kherson and Mariupol. However, Russia was forced to retreat from Kyiv and withdraw from northern Ukraine about a month into the invasion. Russia has encountered civil resistance in occupied areas. Ukrainian forces have mostly held the line in the Donbass, and they have held off Russian troops' advances on Odessa, Mykolaiv, Zaporizhia, Dnipro, and Kharkiv. With no end in sight, Ukraine, Russia, and the West are now preparing for the long haul. This conversation will explore the international law and security lessons of the war and consider what might come next. I'm delighted to introduce our three panelists. Chris Miller is Associate Professor of International History and Co-Director of the Russia and Eurasia program at Fletcher. He's also John Kirkpatrick Visiting Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and Eurasia Director at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. His historical research examines key shifts in international politics and economics. He has written on the history of Russian economic policy, Russian intellectual history, foreign investment, Russia-China relations, and most recently, the development of semiconductors. Abigail Linnington is Professor of Practice in the International Security Studies program at Fletcher. She previously served at National Defense University, where she was Senior Fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies and a visiting faculty at two of the war colleges, the Eisenhower School and the College of International Security Affairs. Retiring at the rank of colonel, she served for 25 years in the U.S. Army as a military strategist and advisor. And last but not least, Tom Dannenbaum is assistant, now I suppose associate professor of international law at Fletcher. He was previously a lecturer in human rights at University College London and a visiting lecturer in law and Robina Foundation Visiting Human Rights Fellow at Yale Law School. He has written on international humanitarian law, international criminal law, international law on the use of force, judging and judicial ethics, just war theory, peacemaking, peacekeeping and transitional justice, shared responsibility, as well as terrorism and counterterrorism. I will pose a couple of questions to each of the panelists, after which we will take some questions from the audience. So first of all, Professor Miller, does the invasion show that Vladimir Putin is a strategic or opportunistic leader? And what aims do Russia, Ukraine, and the West have in the war? And how have they evolved over the last 3 months?
Well, thanks, Art, for that introduction and for setting up our conversation today. I know we've got a lot of ground to cover in 60 minutes. We're probably now 55 minutes left. So I'll try to briefly answer the massive question you posed to me. Just a less Russian foreign policy. I think answering the question about whether Putin is strategic or not is difficult, especially now because if you want to ascertain the strategy behind Russia's war in Ukraine, you need to understand not only how has it gone, how is it intended to go. And it's very clear that it was intended to go very differently than it has actually gone in practice. I think when you look at what the Russians thought would happen in Ukraine, it was a very sensible and strategic decision if their assumptions were right. Now, we now know that their assumptions were wrong. And it's increasingly clear that their assumptions were wrong because they drank their own Kool-Aid about Ukrainian politics. After a decade of spinning propagandistic tales about the divisions within Ukrainian society, they began to believe them themselves. So if you started with that assumption, if you bought the stories you told yourself on Russian television, that in fact it would be a quick war, that Ukrainians would by and large welcome you as your army marched into their streets, and it was far from a crazy thing to do to invade Ukraine. In fact, you could tell yourself a story if you started with the wrong assumptions that would be a brilliant, and I think that's all the evidence suggests. That's how the Kremlin leadership thought the war would go. And from that perspective, I think it was a strategic move. It was a strategic move based on ridiculous assumptions that the Kremlin at the time believed, and I think right now is trying to shake themselves of as they go. And although it's very difficult to interpret what's going on inside the Kremlin, such news tidbits as we get can be reasonably confirmed, suggest there's a fair amount of debate and finger pointing about what went wrong in the Kremlin's assessment and who is to blame about the fact that these false assumptions made it all the way up the hierarchy to Putin himself. I think any sort of realistic assessments that Putin is likely to blame for the unrealistic assumptions. I don't think he's going to get most of the blame in the shakeout. So I think it was a strategy. It was just a good strategy, or a reasonable strategy, I guess, based on ridiculous assumptions. Now, Russia's not the first great power to make strategy based on false assumptions. If you think back through history, happen to know one or two yourselves. So we shouldn't be surprised by this, I don't think. It's not a sort of uniquely Russian trait to misread your neighbors or misread the politics of the countries, but I think that is what happened. And it's important, I think, to understand that Russia's war plan was rational and reasonable given the false assumptions, because it pushes back against a theory that you often hear, especially in the media, that Putin is some sort of crazy. I think that's just not true. I think, in fact, what we've seen over the past 3 months of war is a leader who's slowly coming to realize that, in fact, his initial assumptions were false and adjusting his war important, which is why you've seen Russia initially try to seize Kyiv immediately, then try to surround it, now pulling out entirely from Kyiv and refocusing the war on other parts of Ukraine where it arguably has a better chance of achieving its objectives. Those aren't the tactics of a madman. Those are the tactics of someone who is realizing that they had some false assumptions and adjusting their war plans. Now, the fact that Putin is adjusting, that he's adopting new tactics to take account of the new information he's gotten, a new understanding Ukraine is not going to surrender, didn't surrender on day 3, it's not going to surrender in month 3, is probably not a good thing for trying to end the war, because all the evidence suggests that Russia is preparing for a longer term. It's trying to secretly, covertly mobilize more men into the army, find more soldiers to throw into the Donbass. It's digging in, both in the Donbass and in Kherson in the south of Ukraine, preparing for Ukrainian counterattacks there. So there's no evidence on the Russian side that there's plans for curtailing the military effort anytime soon. And still on the Ukrainian side, I see no evidence that Ukraine is willing to let Russian forces stay on their So in terms of the two sides' war aims, it seems like their war aims have changed substantially since the conflict began on the Russian side, and even on the Ukrainian side. There's been a bit of change in war aims, or at least in the assessment of what's realistic to achieve. So how many Ukrainians can get Russia all the way back to the October 24 final control. So what does that suggest going forward? It suggests, I'm afraid, a longer conflict until one or both parties begin to change their assessment of what's realistic. At least for the next several weeks, if it's longer, I don't see much evidence of that happening.
Thank you. Next question is for Professor Linnington. Why did most Western analysts underestimate Ukraine and overestimate Russia prior to the invasion? Has the war revealed Russia's recent military modernization to be unsuccessful? And how effective has Western security assistance, including weapons but also intelligence sharing, been in improving Ukraine's ability to resist Russia's military campaign?
5 minutes or less. Well, not just the West. I mean, obviously Putin also underestimated President Zelensky and the Ukrainian military's capabilities and their will to fight a military that's 5 times its size. By the end of 2021, looking at the Zelensky presidency coming up on about his 3rd year, I think from the defense sector perspective in the United States and NATO, there were still deep concerns about levels of corruption in government and how much progress President Zelensky had made and the defense sector had made, particularly with regards to the security assistance programs that they were providing by that point. But it would have been also very difficult for NATO to assess the effectiveness of their security assistance programs. They began around 1993, after the fall of the Soviet Union, in efforts to reform and bring the Soviet system, the Soviet-era system, over to a more civil, military, democratic model. And it was difficult to be able to assess that without the current conflict at the strategic level or even at the operational campaign level of fighting. There have been a number of tactical level military assessments of the Ukrainian military based upon their operations in the Donbass that have been largely favorable, based upon the training that they've done at the small unit level, the leadership performance after the devastating results of the fighting in 2014 and 2015. So as I said, the security assistance programs began in 1993, and there's been a continuous relationship through the state partnership program, for example, in the United States with California as their chosen state. But in 2014, after the Russian invasion, the United States upped its focus on security assistance programs, brought in U.S. Special Operations Forces, for example, to work on several different types of missions: unconventional warfare, how to resist occupation, direct actions such as acts of sabotage, work with conventional military units on cyber defense and cyber attacks, also how to work in the social media space to counter Russian disinformation, as well as programs to help with establishing small unit leadership. There's establishment of a non-commissioned officer school, for example, that allowed for the creation of these small unit leaders on the front lines to begin to develop back into the Ukrainian military, because in the Soviet system, they actually had this capability back in the 60s and 70s, but they allowed it to be gutted over time with larger amounts of conscripts into the system that were kept for shorter periods of time. So some of the priorities of the security assistance programs that have been shown now to be more effective than we thought they would necessarily be are in terms of small unit tactics on the ground level for infantry, armor, field artillery, and then combining them together also with air coordination and power. But shifting over to the Russian capabilities and how we may have overestimated the Russian military capabilities for quite some time. I recall in 2014, when Russia invaded, there was a pretty robust discussion in the U.S. Department of Defense among both military leaders and civilian leaders as to the extent of Russian capabilities. They had a number of problems going into Georgia that were on display, and what we see now is that there are three key areas where Russia has demonstrated its ineffectiveness. One is in the level of this small unit leadership, which Ukraine has spent quite a bit of time concentrating on. Command and control only resides at the senior levels. They have very high level leadership that is closer to the front lines, which is why we have seen a number of senior general officers killed in the Russian military. The second is a lack of combined arms preparation and training that we figured was quite effective in the Russian military as we were conducting military exercises over the years. But what we realize now, we had one of the Army intelligence chiefs here a couple of weeks ago to speak, is that many of those exercises are conducted without a live or a thinking adversary across from them. So all of the exercise is pre-scripted, it's on a certain schedule, and there's not a lot of forcing for adaptive leadership throughout the training. And then finally is the concern that the West originally had of the Ukrainian military, which is corruption. You see rampant corruption in the Russian military to a point where, for example, you can see pictures in social media, but also in accredited accounts of rotting body armor or expired food packets, the failure to be able to maintain weapon systems and just carry basic fuel loads. All of which points to a problem at the senior leadership levels of both oversight, but also of deep rot within the system of relying on contractors or contracts where money is being funneled to other purposes than what it was intended. So why don't I just stop there and we can hit the other topics.
Thank you.
As we go.
So, to Professor Dannenbaum, what implications does the war have for international law, particularly four areas: the law on the use of force, international humanitarian law, international criminal law, and international human rights law?
Thanks very much, Eric. That's obviously more easily disposed of in 5 minutes. The short answer is that we are obviously at a fairly pivotal moment in the trajectory of international law as a result of this conflict. And that's partly due to the dichotomy between two features of this conflict and how they relate to international law. The first is the brazenness of the violations. And here I would just actually recharacterize slightly your otherwise meticulous introduction, Eric, that this invasion began in 2014. It's been going on for 8 years and 3 months, not just 3 months. So Russia engaged in a brazen violation of the law prohibiting the use of force in international affairs under the UN Charter in Article 2.4 when it annexed Crimea in 2014 and began to support separatist movements in Donetsk and Luhansk. And those conflicts continued up to the present day. So that was a continuing violation of the use of force and continuing belligerent occupation and armed conflict. That was then obviously expanded, exacerbated significantly on the 24th of February of this year when Russia launched an all-out invasion of Ukraine, seemingly with the ambition, the colonial ambition of territorial conquest. The way in which that war has been conducted, the occupation of Crimea since 2014, the conflict in the Donbass, and the conflict since 24th of February, the last 86 days, has itself manifested a frankly stunning range of violations of the law of armed conflict, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and possibly genocide. In fact, almost every law in the book has been violated. When this is done by a permanent member of the Security Council, has the authority to veto Security Council action. And when it's done by a nuclear power that holds in suspension above the conflict the constant threat of nuclear escalation, this cannot be understood as anything other than one of the most profound challenges to the contemporary international legal order that has existed since its inception. So that's one part of the implication for international law. But to think about the implications for international law more broadly, we also have to think about response. That entails thinking both about the response of Ukraine itself and also the response of third states. And one of the most striking things about this conflict, going all the way back to the beginning in 2014, is the way in which Ukraine has used every available international legal tool, has pursued every available international legal institutional avenue, and has framed diplomatically this entire conflict with reference to international law and in the language of international law as a way of providing a focal point for the political mobilization around Ukraine in terms of support, political mobilization to isolate Russia and to refuse to recognize the gains that it has made in the course of this illegal invasion, most notably through the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And it's done that by litigating the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, Permanent Court of Arbitration, the International Court of Justice, the European Court of Human Rights, by issuing an Article 12.3 declaration under the International Criminal Court, granting the International Criminal Court jurisdiction from 2014 to the present day, by inviting outside investigators, both ICC investigators and foreign national investigators, by joining joint investigative teams with other states in the European Union to pursue war crimes investigations, by seeking to pursue the creation of a special tribunal for the prosecution of aggression, so as to hold accountable the leaders in Russia who were responsible for the illegal war in the first place, by suggesting that it wants to create an international claims commission along the lines of those created following the invasion of Kuwait and after the Ethiopia-Eritrea war at the turn of the millennium, in order to ensure the compensation of victims of the conflict. And by doing this across multiple fora, multiple junctures, and continuing to do it up to the present day, and constantly framing this entire conflict in international law terms when it's engaging with allies and potential allies. And then we can look at how third states have responded to this. We saw a broad condemnation of Russia's invasion, most notably following 2022 escalation, but also the annexation of Crimea. We've seen the most comprehensive economic sanctions imposed on a G20 economy in history. We've seen the creation of multiple multilateral investigative mechanisms through the OSCE, through the Human Rights Council. We've seen multiple states engage in universal jurisdiction investigations within their own systems of domestic criminal justice, so as to pursue war crimes accountability associated with the war crimes in Ukraine. We saw the unprecedented event of 43 states parties to the ICC system referring the situation in Ukraine to the prosecutor. That had never happened before. Across 5 continents, 43 states referring the situation to the ICC prosecutor is an unprecedented event. We saw 42 states yesterday suggest they're going to intervene in a genocide case in the International Court of Justice on the side of Ukraine. We've seen states support the possible creation of a special tribunal for prosecution of aggression. We've seen military support, intelligence support, and other support framed in part around international legal assessments regarding the laws of neutrality, collective self-defense, and how we should understand the relationship between those doctrines and political domestic doctrines and constitutional doctrines around neutrality in various states. So we've seen multiple ways in which states broadly are responding to this situation. Now, the reason this is a pivotal moment is, first of all, we don't know how that's going to end. We don't know where this is going to lead, both in terms of the initial legal violation and the responses. Secondly, we don't know whether this is an anomaly. Is this going to lay the foundation for more comprehensive, more universal, and more equitable responses to these kinds of situations across conflicts and across situations of atrocity more broadly, or is it going to be specific and unique to Ukraine in a way that renders it problematic in terms of legitimacy and the degree to which this underpins the rule of law, or instead suggests the rule of power? And so we're at this moment where we don't know how this is going to play out, but it is very clear that this is going to have significant implications for international law and the authority of international institutions going forward.
Thank you. So I will ask one more round of questions, and then we will open it up to questions from you. So to Professor Miller, how might the weakening of Russian forces impact Eurasian security? How might diminished Russian military presence in places like the South Caucasus, Central Asia, Syria, create power vacuums, and who might fill them?
Yeah, that is an interesting question to ask, and I'll always like thinking about what are the second and third order effects of this conflict going to be. Because although we're just beginning to see some of the second order effects materialize, there will be many, and I think we'll be thinking for many years about what these effects look like. And I think you're right to suggest that in Russia's neighborhood, we're likely to see the most direct immediate effects. So there's already been some suggestion the current state of the Union Azerbaijani conflict has changed because of Russia's weakness right now. I'm surprised if other countries have had tense relations with Russia in the past, but mildly, like Georgia, might also try to push back a bit more than they otherwise would. And in Central Asia, we've certainly seen a major reassessment of relations with Russia over the past couple of months. On the one hand, an increased sense of threat, on the other hand, an increased sense that Russia has a lot fewer tools today than it did 3 months ago to achieve its aims in the region, simply because its military is tied up the weather and won't be carrying Central Asia at a large scale anytime soon. So I think we're in the early stages of seeing the answer to that question materialize, but as we look forward, I think that is the question to be asking ourselves. Where else will this conflict manifest itself in terms of changing power balances elsewhere in the region?
Thank you. To Professor Linnington, you spoke about Western security assistance to Ukraine. How has the West managed escalation risks amid the hostilities? And another question for you to speculate on, how might the entry of Sweden and Finland into NATO impact European security?
So I think with respect to your first question, NATO unity has been key to managing the relationship with Russia and managing escalation. Extensive communication among the partners to try and determine the nature of the capabilities that would be provided to Ukraine, real sense of deliberation on any key weapon systems and whether they are defensive in nature or dual use. In other words, could they be used for offensive means? You probably saw the example of Poland and other countries who proposed providing advanced fighter aircraft that NATO deliberated for quite some time, and so far that debate has slowed down because the nature of that would be potentially escalatory in the relationship with Russia. A lot of the, I think focusing on enabling capabilities has still provided a great deal of help to Ukraine, particularly in the area of intelligence. That, I think the Biden administration ought to be commended for their approach to sharing intelligence in a manner that we have not seen in any other conflict and publicly before Russia invaded in an attempt to deter Russia from doing so. And then after the invasion, I cannot recall this level of intelligence cooperation with a non-ally on the day-to-day operations to be able to help them locate major troop concentrations, command control nodes, and to really bring a lot of the lessons that have been learned over the past 20 years working together in the Middle East, that NATO has been working together in the Middle East, to this new conflict in Ukraine, to Ukraine's advantage. But I think clear communication and unity on behalf of the NATO alliance with Russia to indicate that they are very much in favor of the defense of Ukraine and trying to compel Russia to withdraw, but very clearly drawing the line that they are not in favor of regime change to not give Russia any excuse for escalatory language. With respect to Sweden and Finland, it looks like, based upon the NATO Secretary General's statements in April, that should see smooth sailing for their accession, but we'll know more after the summit in Madrid in June. There was a little hiccup with Turkey, who was not necessarily in favor and used it as an opportunity to put their own issues on the table, but that seems to have been smoothed over to date. There are still some concerns among NATO allies, not so much with Finland and Sweden coming in, but the extent to which each country should invest more in their military, and using what has played out in terms of Russian military capabilities to question the need to invest in more military. For example, France and Italy have said now that Russia has not performed particularly well, do we really need to invest in this, or to go a different route and arguing for EU defensive capabilities without the United States perhaps. But for the most part, it seems as though the allies are marching together right now, but I think the proof will be in the amount of resources and the amount of time that are spent in the next 3 to 4 years on rebuilding readiness across each of these countries, which has been sorely needed. One example, Germany openly shares their readiness levels in their military, and in an effort, I think, to try and gather political support for military spending. But one of their recent reports said that only 30% of their aircraft could get off the ground today. So, if that's the case, it may take years to just try and bring those military capabilities up to a point of day-to-day operations, never mind crisis response. So that's what we'll be looking for in terms of the statements that come from the June summit, but then how are resources actually directed at the problem, and how many training and exercises do we see, and the complexity of those exercises over the next year and beyond.
Thank you. And for those of you who have questions, I encourage you to line up in front of the microphone. So finally, to Professor Dannenbaum, I'd like you to make any predictions you might have about the emerging war crimes investigations and prosecutions in Ukraine, and what makes the crime of aggression more challenging to prosecute than war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide from an institutional perspective?
So with respect to war crimes in the first instance, and really crimes against humanity would fit the same sets of questions here. We have multiple different ways in which war crimes are being investigated in this context. So they're investigated on the ground in Ukraine by the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's Office, which now has a specialized war crimes unit, which is being supported by a number of outside actors through both financial and in-kind assistance. Those prosecutions at the lower level should be relatively straightforward. We already saw the first guilty plea this week by Linnington for killing a civilian. I expect we'll see many more of those. I expect we'll see many more prosecutions of Russian prisoners of war who have committed war crimes. There's a lot of evidence. And one of the advantages in this particular context with respect to war crime prosecutions is they're securing crime scenes relatively quickly after the crimes occurred. They're able, therefore, to gather real evidence, gather ballistics, forensics, as well as significant communication intercepts with respect to evidence connecting individuals to the crimes on the ground, satellite imagery, and so on. So there's a lot of evidence gathering. It's a concerted effort across multiple different states, multiple different actors in the system to collect, consolidate, and preserve that evidence. That's also one of the mandates of the Commission of Inquiry and the Human Rights Council's authority. So there are mechanisms by which evidence is being gathered and maintained that are relatively unprecedented in terms of the degree of coordination, the degree to which crime scenes are being secured quickly, and the degree to which evidence is being collected immediately with reference to prosecutions. Much harder, obviously, is prosecuting those who are further up the command chain. Harder both as an evidential matter, because you have to establish a requisite linkage between those individuals and the crime base that's occurring on the ground, and harder from the perspective of gaining custody of those individuals to the extent they're in Russia and unlikely to travel. With respect to the crime of aggression, there's a separate set of issues. The crime of aggression is the crime of waging war without legal basis. War crimes are about conduct of the war, torture, killing civilians, etc. Crime of aggression is about the invasion itself and the continuation of the war following the invasion. Liability for that at the international criminal law level attaches only to leaders, those in a position to direct and control the political and military action of the state, with the Nuremberg Standard, which was about shaping and influencing state policy. So there's a slightly different threshold across those two, but it's more or less people in leadership positions. That creates a couple of problems. First, the problem of gaining custody, as I mentioned. There's also a jurisdictional problem. The International Criminal Court doesn't have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression for this specific conflict. It has it on a much narrower basis, which doesn't apply here. There's a lot of dispute as to whether domestic systems can exercise jurisdiction over aggression. It's very clear that they can exercise jurisdiction over war crimes, and in fact, states have an obligation to investigate and prosecute war crimes, including war crimes that didn't occur on their territory, where the perpetrator ends up on their territory. That's not the case with the crime of aggression, and in fact there is significant dispute as to whether domestic courts can exercise jurisdiction over the crime of aggression, although Ukrainian courts do have jurisdiction under the domestic law of the crime of aggression and indeed have initiated prosecutions in that direction. The other problem with aggression is immunity. So heads of state and foreign ministers, both of whom would be potentially implicated in the crime of aggression in this instance, have immunity before domestic courts. That is not eliminated by the fact of the crime in question being an international crime. That means that they can't be prosecuted for war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, or aggression before domestic courts. They can be prosecuted before an international court, but the problem is we don't have an international court in this instance. That's why there's been so much discussion around the creation of a special tribunal for the prosecution of aggression that would have the international standing to overcome immunity obstacles and that would be able to exercise jurisdiction in this particular case. That's legally conceivable, but of course it still raises the problem of ever gaining custody of the individuals who would be the subject of those prosecutions. And so one question is whether it's worth it to create that kind of institution, given the unlikelihood of ever gaining custody of the individuals, or whether it's important to create such an institution precisely so that it's ready and available and structured to provide for the prosecution of those individuals should custody ever become a possibility. And in this respect, it's perhaps worth noting the example of Omar al-Bashir, who was in the leadership position in Sudan for a decade, during which there was an arrest warrant outstanding for him at the International Criminal Court, was able to travel without arrest, but ultimately was removed from power and is now in custody in Sudan, and there's an ongoing negotiation as to whether he should be transferred to the International Criminal Court. Worth bearing in mind, these crimes don't have statutes of limitations, so were such a tribunal created, that longer-term horizon prospect would remain on the table. And there's obviously a legitimate debate to be had about whether that's a useful use of political resources in this moment. And I'll just note in particular, one of the concerns that's being raised is one of the states that has been at the vanguard of advocating for this is the United Kingdom. My home state, as you may be able to tell. That raises the obvious problem. The United Kingdom was one of the key actors in the invasion of Iraq, which is one of the most notable examples of an aggressive war since the initiation of the UN Charter that war in 2003. That creates a legitimacy problem for such an aggression tribunal. It would be better, in my view, if the United Kingdom stood back and allowed other states to be at the vanguard of advocating for that particular institution. It doesn't look as though that's going to happen, but I think that would be a mistake for the United Kingdom in particular to be at the forefront of that particular issue.
Thank you. So we now have about 20 minutes for your questions. Please make sure to keep them short and to address them to a panelist. Please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and insights about the situation today. My name is Victoria Kulesha. I have a question about the International Committee of the Red Cross and their involvement with the filtration camps that are in Rostov-on-Don and the way that they have been approaching accusations of supporting these forced deportations of Ukrainians from Mariupol, not doing enough to help to defend the city, not allowing Ukrainian military vehicles to use the Red Cross symbology, which President Zelensky has spoken out about, the same with his advisor for humanitarian corridors, Tatiana Lakina. And their defense is that their mandate is neutrality. So I'd really like to hear your perspectives. At what point can the international community keep listening to this supposed mandate of neutrality with such strong involvement of this humanitarian organization? And at what point does this become complicity? And at what point can it be recognized as so? Thank you.
Professor Dannenbaum?
I can touch on the issue of complicity. It's something that the ICRC has actually grappled with for quite some time. As a matter of law, the question of complicity, the point at which ICRC contributions would potentially rise to the level of criminal accountability would be, in the first instance, when we're talking about aiding and assisting, if they're providing a substantial contribution to the infliction of a crime and doing so in the knowledge that the crime will occur as a result of their contribution. there is no humanitarian exception or good intention exception to that liability as a matter of general customary international law. The International Criminal Court has a slightly higher threshold, which I can touch on if you're interested. However, there have not been prosecutions in past instances where the kind of contribution that you're describing has potentially been subject to the characterization of making a substantial contribution in this direction, but where the position of the ICRC or the other agency engaged in that kind of contribution was that they were trying to mitigate the harm as opposed to exacerbate the harm. And so it's likely, as a matter of prosecutorial discretion, that they would not be prosecuted for that kind of contribution. But it is obviously a tension because even where they're mitigating the harm, their contribution does make it easier to engage in that kind of forcible transfer, which can rise to either level of war crime or crime against humanity. And it is something that is basically unsettled in international criminal law in terms of whether there ought to be any kind of humanitarian exception there or not. On the point about neutrality, that's long been the posture of the ICRC, and it's long been critiqued, particularly where it means that it becomes involved in a very intimate way with war criminals or those engaged in crimes against humanity as a means to try and gain access to populations that would otherwise be inaccessible. And its long-standing position has been we need to maintain that in order to continue to gain access, including in contexts in which access is very difficult and control over that access is held by a bad actor. One can take one of a number of views on whether that's the right kind of policy, either for an organization specifically such as the ICRC, or whether humanitarian actors in general should take that kind of posture. The alternative does itself create a number of challenges, and so there's no obvious answer to that kind of dilemma, but it's a dilemma that the organization has grappled with for a long time.
Thank you.
Great. Please.
My name is Gaurav. I'm a current student at Fletcher. Thank you very much for sharing your insights. Actually, I have 3 questions very short to each one of you.
Just one.
I will keep 1 in 3. So, the first question is to Professor Miller. When you analyze the Russian community, how do you see the mixed opinion coming from the Russian inside people? Because as the Western media is showing that there is a chaos, but when I'm talking with my friends in Moscow and St. Petersburg, they are showing me they are against the war, but there is no such chaos inside. There are mixed opinions against the Putin regime. Second question to Professor Linnington about
Let's stick with one question because there's a number of people behind you, so just as a courtesy to them.
On Russian domestic opinion, I think we have some data points. We have public opinion polling in Russia. And you can be the judge of how seriously we should take it when someone calls you up here and asks you, do you trust the president? If you take it seriously, it shows majority supportive of President Putin. So that's one data point. We have the Russian elite publicly, with only actions, have rallied around the president. But you can imagine that if you had an alternative view, you might not be saying it publicly. So a lot of the data points we have are data discussed. But I think if you read the two more closely, you find a much more divided elite and a much more confused and apathetic populace. And I think this question is made more complicated by the fact that if you don't ask too many questions and just watch TV for half an hour a day, the story you're getting of reality is of a special military operation almost exclusively with Donbass that's only killing Nazis and probably many civilians. And so if that's the reality that you choose to imbibe, it's much easier to support that than the real reality that we know. So I think we need to interpret the whole data with those caveats in mind. There's a lot of Russians who are expressing opposition, a lot of Russians who are supporting something that's not happening. In reality, it's much more violent. Now, the question that really matters is not what is the Russian safety is in the about fake elections that aren't correct. The real question that matters is what do the dozen or 2 dozen security chieftains in the Kremlin do? And that's something that is very, very important and real information. We know how these individuals were trained, we know how they came up through the ranks, but we know very, very little what they think about current events beyond what they choose to say publicly, which we have to assume is very, very careful. So you can find lots of QE reading online from various experts. I think anyone who says they know what the Russian security chiefs say at high confidence is I think one of the things we can say is that there are almost certainly a lot of people in the Russian military desperately trying to help us because they feel like they've been scapegoated in a war that they didn't fight. They didn't choose. And anyone who's below the age of 50 or even 55 is thinking about their future. And that future will involve some period of time with someone's president. Because he's not going to live forever. Middle of that. And so if you're in the mid to high level of Russian bureaucracy, and especially the Russian military, your incentives now are very good. And so I would be thinking a lot about what is the typical person in that position in the Russian security service and military, and what is their calculus, not just about next year, but about
my name is Victor Hauser. I'm a family friend of Fletcher, someone who's graduated from Fletcher. This is for either Professor Linnington or Miller. You both seem to have spent a lot of time thinking about the Russian military, Russian leadership, and frankly, as a citizen, I'm just scared of nuclear conflict. It's inconceivable that the president of Russia has put forces on alert. Foreign minister has said nuclear is a possibility. For years, the Americans always avoided direct confrontation, and now we have direct confrontation. Either one of you could address what do you think the chances are of a miscalculation and nuclear escalation?
Professor Linnington?
Well, they're certainly possible. I'm not going to put a number on them, and we feel, since this most recent invasion 3 months ago, like they are more possible than they were 3 months ago. I certainly see two scenarios of escalation of concern. One is in terms of nuclear use, and I hope, as a lot of the defense analysts have been bantering about on some of those scenarios, that senior leadership in both the United States and in NATO countries have been thinking about some of those scenarios. For example, what if Russia were to use a tactical nuclear weapon somewhere inside of Ukraine? What would decision-making look like in the NATO alliance? I hope that's a conversation that's being had among the key leaders to just talk about even, going so far as to figure out all of their communication mechanisms in the event of crisis. The other that is equally concerning, because I think it's it's actually more likely, is a miscalculation that involves the direct interaction between NATO forces and the Russian military. That may in fact be accidental, just because of increased military operations, particularly around the Black Sea, particularly around the Baltic countries, that could be of concern. And I was glad to see an official release of recent communications between the U.S. Secretary of Defense and the Russian Secretary of Defense this past week, as well as at the military level between the Chiefs of Defense and the U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Because there have habitually been regular communications through those lines, particularly on the military-to-military side. They've been more unreliable on the defense ministry side. And I think the more communication that happens and the clear expresses of intent are important to lower the temperature in case a miscalculation takes place.
Yeah, I'll add one thing to say. I think one is that my view is that the Russian communication has actually been quite clear and not unacceptable. It's normal for Russia to rattle its nuclear saber. It does on a regular basis. It's a natural thing to do for a conventional nuclear power using NATO. And we've seen a lot of this in the past decade or 3 decades of World War I. So I think we shouldn't be surprised by the fact that Putin's is similar, although I think it's actually not exactly clear what that meant. Second thing, the Russian foreign ministry, you mentioned Foreign Minister Lavrov's statement. When he speaks, the Western media gives him the headline, Lavrov threatens nuclear war. His most widely reported statement actually was the He was saying there is a risk of war. However, both the Russian and the U.S. presidents have stated in recent January that nuclear war is inadmissible, and that it's no. So I think actually if you dig deeper into the originals of what Russian leaders are saying, much less worrisome than the headlines the Western media will give you. Obviously, it makes great headlines in Western media. Final thing, is that if you think of the scenarios in which Putin has the most incentive to use a nuclear weapon, a scenario where it's a mental force that's completely fallen apart, those are also scenarios where his orders are least likely to be followed. And so, if you're the Russian president unsure that your orders will be followed, I think that adds another level of uncertainty, which makes it even less likely that it will actually happen.
So we have about 5-6 minutes left, so perhaps we'll collect 3 questions and then we'll do a blitz round, please.
So, hi, my name is Maria Rita, class of 15. I grew up in Latin America. I lived in Southern Africa and I worked with refugees from Central and East Africa, and I'm currently based in Thailand. And I've worked in Myanmar. I don't know if you know, but Myanmar has a military coup, and some Myanmar nationals that are trying to get into Thailand are being sent back into Myanmar. I can't help but notice the difference in treatment with refugees and Ukrainians and everywhere else. Do you think that, well, it's so obvious to me, and I'm hoping it's also obvious to other people, do you think this has the power to change something in terms of international human rights law when it comes to asylum seekers and refugees?
Thank you.
Well, one question, I don't actually, I've only taken classes for the rest of the animals, so I don't know who's the best answer this. But with the real collapse, with the real collapse of arms control between the U.S. and Russia, really the only arms deal or arms treaty that's in effect right now is New START, which was thankfully restarted before this conflict began. But that will expire in the not too distant future. With this current conflict, what is the likelihood of rebuilding a lot of the arms control and bilateral collaboration, or bilateral in the sense of NATO, between Russia and Europe and the U.S.? Things like open skies, and is it NTF, the one that the short range, the medium range ballistic missiles? What is the likelihood that any of that is going to be able to come back after this war, and how would that go?
INF treaty.
INF, thank you. I always forget the name of that one. Sorry.
So I was just wondering, since it's likely that the war will be long, how long do you think that the rest of the international community will be able to keep up the sanctions, especially with the effect it's had globally? And then post-war, since the sanctions have been effective in crippling the Russian economy, what do you think post-war it's going to look like for Russia and regionally?
Thank you. So for final thoughts, let's turn to Professor Dannenbaum first.
Let me just address the refugee question first. I think I'm not going to have a very optimistic answer, I'm afraid. Refugee politics are domestic politics, and they are racist politics. It's not just a question of the disparate treatment of Ukrainian refugees and refugees from any other conflict zone, situation, and persecution. That's, of course, obvious, but it's even disparate treatment with respect to which refugees are allowed in and under what conditions from Ukraine itself. I don't see that as being likely to change. That's not an area in which I think there's much reason for optimism in terms of whether this particular conflict is going to generate any kind of renewed commitment to the principles underpinning refugee law. When I said earlier that there was a question as to how this would play out in terms of possible greater equitable application of international law more broadly, so putting aside refugee law for one moment, one of the reasons in which there is at least some minimal basis for optimism, but I think it's minimal at best, is that this is the first time in which one of the powerful actors in the international system is really the subject of a concerted accountability effort. So when we're thinking about selectivity in international criminal law, Russia is traditionally a beneficiary of selectivity. It exercises power through the Security Council to shield its nationals from criminal accountability. It sat in judgment in Nuremberg in a tribunal that was specifically structured so as to preclude jurisdiction and accountability for those who sat in judgment. So if we're ever going to make any progress at all within international criminal law in terms of the application of international criminal law to the powerful, to worry about selectivity in this instance would, I think, be the wrong moment to make that concern the personal concern. This is one of the few moments where there's actually the possibility of the application of criminal accountability to the powerful. And then that sets a precedent, and it does create a new set of conditions for future efforts, including the investigation in Afghanistan. Do I think that it's likely that we're then going to see the same kind of concerted effort in other situations? No, I don't. But I also think that this is a moment where we should try and take advantage of the fact that there is a possibility of holding powerful actors to account and try and make the system better. But on refugee law, I'm much more pessimistic, because really that is ultimately about the domestic politics within each state that is exercising the authority to grant or deny asylum, and those politics are toxic.
Thank you. Professor Linnington.
I assume you want me to take the arms control question?
Yes.
Well, this is really, this is a significant political issue. It's not one for the military members on the table, and it has not been an area where political leadership in the United States or in Russia has given it a lot of time. It is always on the agenda in conference summits on a bilateral basis between the political leadership, and I've definitely seen it at the chief of defense level, but it has not been a substantive priority for U.S. political leaders to pursue, just because of their skepticism, I believe, of the ability to move forward. But it is certainly a subject that Russian military leaders have put on the agenda over the course of the last decades in every single bilateral engagement. So there are fundamentally people that focus on this within our countries and are subject matter experts on it. There is some level of desire among those experts. The question is whether there are senior political leaders at the national level that want to make this a priority to pursue.
And finally, Professor Miller.
A question on sanctions. I mean, it seems to me very hard to imagine the Western sanctions being lifted so long as Russian forces are in Ukraine, and Russian forces in Ukraine for some time. That was both the February 24th boundaries, but also the legal boundaries. So given that context, that's bad news for food prices, for energy prices, for consumers, everyone, consumers of energy, everyone. I think that will persist. And the other interesting question is, how long will Russia be disrupting shipping out of Ukraine's last ports? There are ideas being discussed of ways to forcibly open trade. The U.S. has done in the past for to secure the flow of oil and all. That requires a risk, which the Strong administration doesn't want to take. But that is a crucial, I think, question for global food prices, and really less so for the United States and for the developed countries that rely on both Russian and Ukrainian resources. The other aspect of this is the impact, obviously, on Ukrainians and disasters in economic terms as well as in human terms. The impact on Russians is also quite substantial. It's small by 10%. Armies at war abroad, and so this will, in the long run, create right now, only one person currently operating, for example, so that's spare parts, a whole range of Russian manufacturers. So that's a question that Russia will address over the medium run rather than over the short run, and that will, I don't think, have any effect on their short-term plans.
Well, that's all the time we have. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but please join me in a round of applause for our
I